Hello students, welcome to part 3 of Nationalism in India. Previous two parts have been already uploaded. If you didn't watch previous two parts, make sure to watch them first. Link is given below. In this video, I am going to discuss about Civil Disobedience Movement, Salt March, Poona Pact and limits of the Civil Disobedience Movement. These topics are very important topics for class 10th board exam. Questions have been oftenly asked from these topics. This video is very helpful as well as very informative for you. Be with this video till the end. First, we will know about the formation of the Swaraj Party. This is very important question that how the Swaraj Party was formed. As we have seen in the previous part that due to Chauri Chaura incident, Mahatma Gandhi had to withdraw the movement because due to this incident, the movement was turning into the violent movement and it was losing the principle of the non-cooperation movement and principle of Mahatma Gandhi because all movements led by Mahatma Gandhi was based on the principle of non-violence. As soon as violence takes place in any movement led by Mahatma Gandhi immediately called off the movement. The sudden withdrawal of non-cooperation movement by Mahatma Gandhi was very shocking for many Congress leaders. This was met with a lot of disagreements among leaders of the Congress party. Within the Congress, some wanted to continue the mass movement as non-cooperation, while some leaders were by now tired of mass struggles and wanted to participate in elections to the provincial councils that had been set up by the Government of India Act of 1919. They felt that it was important to oppose British policies within the councils, argue for reform, and also demonstrate that these councils were not truly democratic. Through the participation in elections to the provincial council and through the participation in the provincial council, they could get the chance for the participation in the decision making process. They could oppose anti-Indian policies made by British government and they could also give some suggestion to the British government for reform. So on 1st January 1923, after the Gaya Annual Conference in December 1922 of the National Congress, this conference is also very important. C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru formed the Swaraj Party within the Congress to argue for a return to council politics. The party sought greater self-government and political freedom for the Indian people from the British Raj. But younger leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose pressed for more radical mass agitation and for full independence. Simon Commission is one of the most important topics for class 10th board exam. This topic is not only important for class 10th board exam but also for many competitive exams. Question may come, what was Simon Commission? Why it was not welcomed by Indians? Because it was not welcomed by Indians. So let us see what was Simon Commission, why it was not welcomed by Indians. In 1927, the new Tory government was made or formed in Britain. The new Tory government in Britain constituted a statutory commission under Sir John Simon, which was named as Simon Commission. At the time of passing of 1919 Act, it was decided by British government that after every 10 years, one commission would be sent to India for evaluating the political and constitutional status of India. So this commission was made earlier. It was set up in response to the nationalist movement and was to look into the functioning of the constitutional system in India and suggest changes. The commission had 7 British members but no Indian members. This was seen as a deliberate move to insult the self-respect of Indians. Definitely, if any commission is made for the reform of the constitutional status and the political status, definitely the countrymen should be given the participation. So exclusion of Indian from this commission was the big insult of Indians. In 1927, the Congress leader decided to boycott the commission at every stage and in every form. When the Simon Commission arrived in India in 1928, it was greeted with the slogan, "Go back, Simon." All parties, including the Congress and the Muslim League, participated in the demonstration. Demand of Purna Swaraj is also very important question. Explain about the demand of Purna Swaraj. When British government saw the protests against the Simon Commission, British government wanted to satisfy the Congress leaders. For satisfying the Congress leaders, the Viceroy Lord Irwin announced to hold a roundtable conference, which was a series of meetings held in three sessions to discuss a future constitution in October 1929. But this did not satisfy the Congress leaders. The radicals within the Congress led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose became more assertive. The liberals and moderates who were proposing a constitutional system within the framework of British dominion gradually lost their influence. In December 1929, under the presidency of Jawaharlal Nehru, the Lahore Congress formalized the demand of Purna Swaraj or full independence for India. This is very important point. It was declared that 26 January 1930 would be celebrated as the Independence Day when people were to take a pledge to a struggle for complete independence. But the celebrations attracted very little attention. So Mahatma Gandhi had to find a way to relate this abstract idea of freedom to more concrete issues of everyday life. The Salt March and the Civil Disobedience Movement. After the failure of the Roundtable Conference and the Purna Swaraj movement, Mahatma Gandhi had to find a way to relate the abstract idea of freedom to more concrete issues of everyday life. Mahatma Gandhi found in salt a powerful symbol that could unite the nation. On 31st January 1930, he sent a letter to Viceroy Irwin stating 11 demands. Some of these were of general interest, others were specific demands of different classes from industrialists to peasants. The idea was to make the demands wide ranging so that all classes within Indian society could identify with them and everyone could be brought together in a unified campaign. The most stirring of all was the demand to abolish the salt tax. Salt was something consumed by the rich and the poor alike, and it was one of the most essential items of food. The tax on salt and the government monopoly over its production, Mahatma Gandhi declared, revealed the most oppressive phase of British rule. Salt March as the mark of beginning of civil disobedience movement. On 31st January 1930, Mahatma Gandhi sent a letter to Viceroy Irwin stating 11 demands. His letter was, in a way, an ultimatum. If the demands were not fulfilled by 11 March, the letter stated the Congress would launch a civil disobedience campaign. Irwin was unwilling to negotiate, so Mahatma Gandhi started his famous Salt March, accompanied by 78 of his trusted volunteers. The march was over 240 miles from Gandhiji's ashram in Sabarmati to the Gujarati coastal town of Dandi. The volunteers walked for 24 days about 10 miles a day. Thousands came to hear Mahatma Gandhi wherever he stopped, and he told them what he meant by Swaraj and urged them to peacefully defy the British. On 6th April, he reached Dandi and ceremonially violated the law manufacturing salt by boiling seawater. This marked the beginning of the civil disobedience movement. Now, how the civil disobedience movement was different from the non-cooperation movement? It is also important question. People were now asked not only to refuse cooperation with the British as they have done in 1921 to 1922 during the non-cooperation movement, but also to break colonial laws. In civil disobedience movement, they wanted to break the colonial laws. Thousands in different parts of the country broke the salt law, manufactured salt, and demonstrated in front of government salt factories. As the movement spread, foreign cloth was boycotted and liquor shops were picketed. Peasants refused to pay revenue and chowkidari taxes. Village officials resigned, and in many places, forest people violated forest laws, going into reserve forest to collect wood and graze cattle. Colonial government's brutal repression of the civil disobedience movement turned it into a violent movement. Worried by the development of the civil disobedience movement, the colonial government began arresting the Congress leaders one by one. This led to violent clashes in many places. When Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a devout disciple of Mahatma Gandhi, was arrested in April 1930, angry crowds demonstrated in the streets of Peshawar facing armored cars and police firing. Many were killed. A month later, when Mahatma Gandhi himself was arrested, industrial workers in Solapur attacked police posts, municipal buildings, law courts, and railway stations, all structures that symbolized British rule. A frightened government responded with a policy of brutal repression. Peaceful satyagrahis were attacked, women and children were beaten, and about 1 lakh people were arrested. Now, Gandhi Irvin Pact. This is also very important. When the civil disobedience movement turned into a violent movement, Mahatma Gandhi once again decided to call off the movement and entered into a pact with Irvin on 5th March 1931. This is very important point. By this Gandhi Irvin Pact, Gandhiji consented to participate in the Round Table Conference. The Congress had boycotted the first in London, and the government agreed to release the political prisoners. In December 1931, Gandhiji went to London for the conference, but the negotiations broke down and he turned disappointed. Then relaunch of civil disobedience movement. After returning back to India from the second Roundtable Conference, Mahatma Gandhi discovered that the government had begun a new cycle of repression. Ghaffar Khan and Jawaharlal Nehru were both in jail. The Congress had been declared illegal, and a series of measures had been imposed to prevent meetings, demonstrations, and boycotts. With great apprehension, Mahatma Gandhi relaunched the civil disobedience movement. For over a year, the movement continued, but by 1934, it lost its momentum. Participation of different social groups in the civil disobedience movement. In the countryside, rich peasant communities. In the countryside, rich peasant communities like the Patidas of Gujarat and the Jats of Uttar Pradesh were active in the movement. Being producers of commercial crops, they were very hard hit by the trade depression and falling prices. As their cash income disappeared, they found it impossible to pay the government's revenue demand. And the refusal of the government to reduce the revenue demand led to widespread resentment. These rich peasants became enthusiastic supporters of the civil disobedience movement, organizing their communities and at times forcing reluctant members to participate in the boycott programs. For them, the fight for Swaraj was a struggle against high revenues, but they were deeply disappointed when the movement was called off in 1931 without the revenue rates being revised. So, when the movement was restarted in 1932, many of them refused to participate. The poorer peasantry. The poorer peasantry was not just interested in the lowering of the revenue demand. Many of them were small tenants cultivating land they had rented from landlords. As the depression continued and cash income dwindled, the small tenants found it difficult to pay their rent. They wanted the unpaid rent to the landlord to be remitted. They joined a variety of radical movements, often led by socialists and communists. Apprehensive of raising issues that might upset the rich peasants and landlords, the Congress was unwilling to support no rent campaigns in most places. So the relationship between the poor peasants and Congress remained uncertain. Now, participation of the business classes. Every group were associated with their own aspirations. During the First World War, Indian merchants and industrialists had made huge profits and become powerful. Keen on expanding their business, they now reacted against colonial policies that restricted business activities. They wanted protection against imports of foreign goods and a rupee sterling foreign exchange ratio that would discourage imports. To organize business interests, they formed the Indian Industrial and Commercial Congress in 1920 and the Federation of the Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industries in 1927. This is very important point. Led by prominent industrialists like Purushottam Das, Thakur Das, and G.D. Birla, the industrialists attacked colonial control over the Indian economy and supported the civil disobedience movement when it was first launched. They gave financial assistance and refused to buy or sell imported goods. Most businessmen came to see Swaraj as a time when colonial restrictions on business would no longer exist and trade and industry would flourish without constraint. But after the failure of the Roundtable Conference, business groups were no longer uniformly enthusiastic. They were apprehensive of the spread of militant activities and worried about prolonged disruption of business as well as of the growing influence of socialism amongst the younger members of the Congress. The industrial working classes. The industrial working classes did not participate in the civil disobedience movement in a large numbers, except in the Nagpur region. As the industrialists came closer to the Congress, workers stayed aloof. But in spite of that, some workers did participate in the civil disobedience movement, selectively adopting some of the ideas of Gandhian program like boycott of foreign goods as part of their own movements against low wages and poor working conditions. Participation of other people. There were strikes by railway workers in 1930 and dock workers in 1932. In 1930, thousands of workers in Chota Nagpur, Teen Mines wore Gandhi caps and participated in protest rallies and boycott campaigns. But the Congress was reluctant to include workers' demand as part of its program of struggle. It felt that this would alienate industrialists and divide the anti-imperial forces. Large-scale participation of women. Another important feature of the civil disobedience movement was the large-scale participation of women. During Gandhiji's Salt March, thousands of women came out of their homes to listen to him. They participated in protest marches, manufactured salt, and picketed foreign cloth and liquor shops. Many went to jail. In urban areas, these women were from high caste families. In rural areas, they came from rich peasant households. Moved by Gandhiji's call, they began to see service to the nation as a sacred duty of women. Yet this increased public role did not necessarily mean any radical change in the way the position of women was visualized. Gandhiji was convinced that it was the duty of women to look after home and heart, be good mothers and good wives. And for a long time, the Congress was reluctant to allow women to hold any position of authority within the organization. It was keen only on their symbolic presence. All social groups didn't have abstract concept of Swaraj. Not all social groups were moved by the abstract concept of Swaraj. One such group was the nation's untouchables, who from around the 1930s had begun to call themselves Dalit or oppressed. For long, the Congress had ignored the Dalits for fear of offending the Sanatanis, the conservative high caste Hindus. But Mahatma Gandhi declared that Swaraj would not come for 100 years if untouchability was not eliminated. He called the untouchables Harijans or the children of God, organized satyagraha to secure their entry into temples and access to public wells, tanks, roads, and schools. He himself cleaned toilets to dignify the work of the Bhangi and persuaded upper caste to change their heart and give up the sin of untouchability. But many Dalit leaders were keen on a different political solution to the problems of the community. Now, what were the limits of the civil disobedience movement? First is limited participation of Dalits. As many Dalit leaders were keen on a different political solution to the problems of the community, they began organizing themselves, demanding reserved seats in educational institutions and a separate electorate that would choose Dalit members for legislative councils. Political empowerment, they believed, would resolve the problems of their social disabilities. Dalit participation in the civil disobedience movement was therefore limited, particularly in the Maharashtra and Nagpur region, where their organization was quite strong. Clash between Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and Mahatma Gandhi on the demand of separate electorate for Dalits. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who organized the Dalits into the Depressed Classes Association in 1930, clashed with Mahatma Gandhi at the Second Roundtable Conference by demanding separate electorates for Dalits. When the British government conceded Ambedkar's demand, Gandhiji began a fast unto death. He believed that separate electorates for Dalits would slow down the process of their integration into society. Ambedkar ultimately accepted Gandhiji's position, and the result was the Poona Pact of September 1932. It gave the depressed classes reserved seats in provincial and central legislative council, but they were to be voted in by the general electorate. The Dalit movement, however, continued to be apprehensive of the Congress-led national government. Disunity between Hindu and Muslim communities. Some of the Muslim political organizations in India will also lukewarm in their response to the civil disobedience movement. After the decline of the non-cooperation Khilafat movement, a large section of Muslims felt alienated from the Congress. From the mid-1920s, the Congress came to be more visibly associated with openly Hindu religious nationalist groups like the Hindu Mahasabha. As relations between Hindus and Muslims worsened, each community organized religious processions with militant fervor, provoking Hindu-Muslim communal clashes and riots in various cities. Every riot deepened the distance between the two communities. Domination of the Hindu Mahasabha. The Congress and the Muslim League made efforts to renegotiate an alliance, and in 1927 it appeared that such a unity could be forced. The important differences were over the question of representation in the future assemblies that were to be elected. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, one of the leaders of the Muslim League, was willing to give up the demand for separate electorates if Muslims were assured reserved seats in the Central Assembly and representation in proportion to population in the Muslim dominated provinces, Bengal and Punjab. Negotiations over the question of representation continued, but all hope of resolving the issues at the All Parties Conference in 1928 disappeared when M.R. Jaikar of the Hindu Mahasabha strongly opposed efforts at compromise. Disunited movement. Civil disobedience movement was also disunited movement. Different sections of people in civil disobedience movement had their own aspirations, hence the struggle was not united and there was discontent among the participants. When the civil disobedience movement started, there was thus an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust between communities. Alienated from the Congress, large sections of Muslims could not respond to the call for a united struggle. Many Muslim leaders and intellectuals expressed their concern about the status of Muslims as a minority within India. They feared that the culture and identity of minority would be submerged under the domination of a Hindu majority. Like, share, and subscribe.